We're just back from Jakarta, I know, where there was another meeting, a trilateral.
Yeah, we had a trilateral between the Americans, the Chinese, and the Southeast Asians. And it's interesting because there are a lot of those kinds of meetings going on now, but it showcases the disconnect between the American narrative about the region and I think the narrative that a lot of Asians have about the region. The Americans are talking entirely about U.S.-China competition and forging coalitions among countries that don't really share the American perspective on China. For most Asians, and particularly for Southeast Asians, their view of China is not nearly as securitized. But also, the Americans tend to think that because they're a military power, we sail boats and fly planes around, that somehow that assures our own centrality in Asia. And I just don't think that's how Asians are really
But Evan, is that really true? Because, I mean, obviously, in terms of trade, investment, and economics, right, it is true that a lot of Southeast Asia leans China, right? I mean, probably most conspicuous is a country like where you just came from, Indonesia, right? Nickel mining, et cetera, dominated by Chinese investment. Infrastructure, light rail, dominated by the Chinese as well. While that's true, the security element, simply because of what's been going on, the militarization in the South China Sea and China's antics there, I mean, they have not gone unnoticed by a lot of Southeast Asian countries.
Yeah, but I think you need to look at the arc of American involvement in the region over the last few decades. The U.S. wasn't a leader in Asia just because it was a security provider. It was a leader in Asia also because it kept its market open. It was the demand for which Asian-led exporters powered their way to prosperity. And it was a regional standard setter on trade, investment, technology.
Now it's pulling back on both, is what you're saying?
No, I think the U.S. security role is assured for the time being because a lot of countries, as you're implying, are afraid of China. And they view the American presence as a good over-the-horizon balance or a balance to China more directly. But in the economic area, there are obviously a lot of questions about whether the United States is still committed to the pillars that made it a player in this part of the world, keeping its market open, being a standard setter, willing to provide public goods as opposed to just being self-interested. And so, to be honest, there's a kind of crisis of confidence of American leadership in the region where people are asking a lot of questions about what role the United States wants to play. And it's not the first time that's happened in the region. It's happened before.
No, fair enough. Sherry?
Yeah, and I want to actually tie in this Gulf region angle to what you guys were just talking about there in terms of U.S. are trying to balance out to China. Because, sure, a lot of deals won, and the Trump administration can really call it a win and celebrate. But do you think it can eventually get some pushback down the road? Because this is a region where China exerts a lot of influence. And the question last week that I was asking is, will this be the moment where the Gulf region has to choose between the U.S. and China? What if all these chips that this region gets ends up in China and so on?
Yeah, you know what's funny about that? For all that the United States and China are different from each other, they're different politically, ideologically, economically, strategically, they're the same in one respect. They're kind of strategic narcissists that often refract what's happening in a region through the prism of their own competition. But as you're implying, that's not how countries, whether in Asia, as Martin was saying, or in the Gulf, as you were saying, think about their own objectives. They're focused on their own agendas, which means that the mathematical operations that matter to them are addition and multiplication, not subtraction and division. They want more connections, more choices, more partnerships in more directions on the compass. And that means not choosing. And in the Gulf, what's interesting about the Chinese profile is it's gone from being something that was largely extractive to something that's increasingly focused on technology, especially in the digital space, construction, and then often at the marriage of digital and construction. So if you look at the Saudi Arabian Vision 2030 projects, for instance, there are actually a lot of Chinese companies and Chinese technologies that are in that mix. But what struck me the most is how Saudi Arabia has succeeded in articulating its own objectives and then using demand-side pull to get the Chinese to adapt to their needs rather than the other way around. And I think given that, the Americans are not going to have a lot of success in simply telling people, don't take China's money, don't take China's technology. Whether it's the Emirates or the Saudis or, frankly, a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, they've been pretty successful at extracting more from more and getting both sides to play to them. And that's ultimately what agency is about. It's about fostering a balance of power that strengthens your independence and creates more options for yourself. I think that's what we're seeing across the global south, but also in rapidly rising industrial regions, including Asia and the Gulf.
And as you put it, this strategic narcissism of the U.S. and China, do you think it will eventually lead to, I mean, I think that is really the consensus, more fragmentism than the world is primed for. Yesterday, I was on a call with a couple of semiconductor companies executives, and all they talked about is really uncertainty. They just don't know. But one of them actually point out the possibility of multiple, multifaceted decoupling, not just between the U.S. and China, but perhaps 5 pieces of the world.
Yeah, I think that's right. In fact, you can see it in the trade rules. It's funny. If you remember, in 2016, President Obama gave this very interesting interview to the Wall Street Journal, and he was asked to make the case for the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. Remember that from the Jurassic era, the TPP? And he was asked why the United States should be in the TPP, and he said something like this. He said, well, if the United States doesn't write the rules, China will write the rules out in that part of the world, meaning Asia. And if he'd been right about that, then when President Trump took the United States out of the TPP, China should have come in to be the rule writer. But as we all know, that's not actually what happened. What happened is the other 11 got together, solidified the agreement, put in place a set of rules, albeit influenced by the United States, but with neither China nor the United States in the room. And on technology standards, on trade rules, on pacts and agreements, I think what we're seeing is a multiplicity of players forging rules that are often in their own interest. And in Asia, that's particularly apropos because you have a lot of large, capable, highly self-interested powers and players that don't just want to get caught betwixt and between. So look at something like cross-border data flows. Increasingly, whether it's India or it's Korea or it's China, you actually have a patchwork of rules and companies having to adapt to a set of rules. It's not an integrated set of rules. So I think in some areas you have to look at that question with some granularity, but on a sectoral basis and on a national basis, fragmentation is going to be the order of the day. And that really belies this headline geopolitical story that it's the United States or China, or it's some kind of Cold War where everybody lines up on one side or the other. There are a lot of people writing rules, and that's also true in the technology space. And because technology standards are largely set in private sector and engineering-led bodies, not in intergovernmental groups, that gives an opportunity for Asian countries that are pioneering different sets of standards. India is one example, to export their indigenous standards in new ways. India has done that on data, for instance, with digital public infrastructure, where they've used something called India Stack to bring people into the organized financial system, and now you have countries around the world, in Africa, in the Gulf and Southeast Asia, beginning to assimilate some elements of that model. So as you're implying, there are a lot of models out there, and I think that could mean a more fragmented landscape for companies.
You know, and talking about cooperation, and you're just back from Indonesia, which is part of ASEAN, right? Yeah. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations. I mean, none of the officials from there are going to say it publicly, but privately, I think a lot of them will probably admit that at the end of the day, try as we might, we're still basically just 10 individual states, each with our own interests. So cooperation really is never going to be that tight or that positive. Would you agree with that? And I'm also curious, right? This whole question of agency, right? These 10 economies or states, they are small, medium at best, medium to small powers, right? Which can have agency, but when you're talking about 800-pound gorillas like the U.S. and China, it's all relative, right?
Sure. So everybody operates within constraints. But I think the first thing is it's important not to conflate ASEAN with Southeast Asia. ASEAN, the 10, has a lot of structural problems that even ASEAN officials have been familiar with for a long time. Yeah. For one thing, they have consensus decision-making rather than majority decision-making. And if you have consensus decision-making, you have to get all 10 on board. And even though ASEAN's own eminent persons groups have recommended getting rid of that for years, they're still stuck in this box. Second, they have alphabetically rotating chairs, which means you have stronger chairs like Indonesia, and you have less strong chairs like Cambodia and Laos. And there hasn't really been a strong ASEAN secretariat to backstop that. Third, some political systems like Thailand have become less coherent, while some like Indonesia have become more coherent. So I think we have to not conflate Southeast Asia with ASEAN, because you do have some ASEAN countries like Indonesia, that's a member of the G20, that are trying to use those vehicles to break out of an ASEAN box. Now, you mentioned nickel before. And you mentioned localization. Actually, Indonesia, because it had an export ban going back to, I think, 2014 on processed minerals, has been able to compel Chinese companies to do a lot of the processing inside Indonesia itself.
Value
added inside the country. So the real name of the game, especially for the stronger Southeast Asian economies, is how to extract more of the value-added investment and keep it in the country. You can't look at that on an ASEAN-wide basis for the reasons that you say. But on an individual basis and in individual sectors, these countries have some agency and they should use it. And remember, with the nickel ban, at that time, Indonesia was widely criticized, especially by Western trade types, for being WTO not compliant, and it's not good, it's localization. But actually, if you look at the pattern of what's happened with Chinese companies, in some ways it has worked pretty well for Indonesia. So that's a model that could be replicable.
So on security, right, Indonesia and the U.S. under Prabowo, the new president in Indonesia, newish president, right, they've actually increased defense cooperation. They've gotten even closer and tighter, right? That's one example. But the broad, I think, risk or trend has been in Southeast Asia that this U.S. role of offshore balancer, right, just as with in economics, right, and trade, whether the U.S. is a reliable partner anymore or it's inconsistent, I think the same thing could be said about security now, too, no?
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to be a balancer. It's another thing to ask people to look at the situation entirely through the prism of China in the way the United States does. And I think that's where it's getting harder for the United States. I'll just give you a mundane example. Australia is a country that in many ways is closer to the United States strategically than any other in the region.
Agreed.
Australians have fought shoulder to shoulder with Americans in every war since 1918.
Yes.
In fact, at the Battle of Hamel in 1918, Australian forces, actually there was an Australian commander under whom American forces fought, General Sir John Monash. But even though Australia shares the general strategic zeitgeist of skepticism about China, operationally, there are some challenges for the U.S.-Australia alliance. For instance, the United States wants Australia to pre-commit its forces to contingencies, like in the Taiwan Strait, in order to do long-term war planning. But for sovereignty reasons, no Australian government, Labour government, or even had the coalition won a coalition government, is going to pre-commit in that way. So actually, the more the Americans focus on China, the more it sometimes sharpens contradictions within these partnerships. I had a boss in the State Department who recently passed away, a guy named Richard Armitage. He was Deputy Secretary of State, old Asia hand. And Rich famously said that if the United States wanted to get China right, it had to get Asia right. And what he meant by that was to shape China's choices, you need to properly shape your relationships and get the strategic environment around China right. But the reality is, over the last decade, what I think I've seen is Armitage upside down. The United States is making every relationship policy and initiative in the region derivative of its obsession with China. And that's just not how countries in the region necessarily see it. They want to cooperate with the U.S. They want the U.S. as a balancer, but they don't want to securitize all elements of technology cooperation, economic cooperation, investment cooperation. And so they're not as responsive when the United States sharpens the contradictions in that way.
Yeah, sure.
So would that lead to tougher trade negotiations with these Asian economies, tougher for the Trump administration than they had expected?
Yeah, it could, because, I mean, as your reporter was implying earlier when we talked about Japan, I think a lot of Asian governments are confused. They can't figure out what the U.S. bottom line is. And also, the U.S. is really more focused in a transactional way on deals rather than on what we used to call trade agreements. I had a former boss in government named Bob Zellick. He was U.S. trade representative. You remember, back in those days, the U.S. was doing full-blown, across and behind the border free trade agreements with Australia, with Singapore, with Korea, and so on. What we're talking about now are deals. And part of the challenge is that, by my count, the administration has articulated not one, not two, not three, not four, but even 5 completely disconnected rationales for what it's trying to do and why. And in many cases, they lead you to completely different policy outcomes. And that leads to some confusion. I'll just give you an example. So they've said, for example, they want to use the tariffs to raise revenue. If you want to use tariffs to raise revenue, you need tariffs to be high, but not so high that they become trade prohibitive, because otherwise you can't raise revenue anymore from tariffs as an external revenue raising source. Sometimes they say they want to reshore everything, in which case you need tariffs to be trade prohibitive. Sometimes they say it's just deal making, in which case you have to be prepared to roll them back. Sometimes they say it's about other areas like fentanyl, in which case it's not clear that just because you move on reciprocal tariffs, all the tariffs go away. And sometimes they imply that there's other rationales in the mix. So if you're sitting in Tokyo, you're sitting in Seoul, or you're sitting especially in Beijing, it's hard to extrapolate strategy from where the American narrative is. And I think that's partly where the administration is going to have to get some clarity from some of these partners. I don't know if it means tougher, to use your word, but it means it's going to be harder sledding and a longer slog, unless countries can extract a quick deal to basically ring fence this and make it go away. And I think that's what Tokyo and even Beijing are trying to do right now.